My name is Mike, and for 6 agonizing months I'd been the ghost haunting my own life. If you've ever had your confidence chipped away piece by someone you're supposed to trust, then you know what I'm talking about. It's not a sudden storm, it's a slow, grinding erosion. It's the acid drip of doubt that eats away at the bedrock of who you think you are. For 25 years I've been in construction. I started as a grunt, hauling rebar until my shoulders screamed, and I worked my way up to foreman on some of the biggest jobs in the state. I know the smell of wet concrete before dawn, the specific groan of a tower crane under a heavy load, the subtle shift in the air that tells you a storm's rolling in. It's a world of tangible things, of physics and stress loads and cold, hard reality. But for the last half year I was living in a fog of whispers and phantom mistakes. I was foreman on the Pinnacle Tower project, a 40-story monument of glass and steel that was supposed to be the crown jewel of the city's new downtown development. It was $1 billion baby, and the pressure was immense. And for months it had been hemorrhaging money and flirting with disaster. A pallet of premium copper wiring, worth 50 grand, vanished from a locked container. A critical hydraulic line on a backhoe was found expertly sliced, almost causing a trench collapse. A batch of concrete failed its stress test because the mixture was off, forcing us to tear out an entire floor's foundation work. Each time my boss, Richard Davies, would call me into his pristine, air-conditioned office on the edge of the sprawling, muddy site. Rich wasn't a construction guy. He was an MBA, a numbers man sent by the corporate office to optimize the asset. He wore tailored suits that cost more than my truck and spoke in a language of synergy and deliverables. He saw the job site not as a collection of people, but as a spreadsheet of human capital, and his spreadsheet was showing a lot of red ink. He'd lean back in his leather chair, a look of profound disappointment on his face, and say things like, "Mike, we can't keep having these losses. The investors are getting nervous. These accidents, they all seem to happen on your watch." He never accused me outright, not at first. It was more insidious than that. He'd ask if I was feeling okay, if things at home were all right, if the pressure was maybe getting to be a bit much for me. He suggested with a tone of faux concern that maybe I was stretched too thin, that my old school methods weren't suited for a project this complex. Then came the whispers, which he'd reluctantly share with me. "Some of the crew think you've been forgetful, Mike. There's talk you've been unsteady. A few guys mentioned they smelled alcohol on your breath after lunch. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. It was poison, pure, calculated poison. And the worst part was, it started to work. I stopped sleeping. I'd lie awake at night, replaying every minute of the day, searching for the mistake I must have made. Did I forget to check the lock on that container? Did I miss a pre-op inspection on that backhoe? I'd walk the site like a ghost, double-checking, triple-checking everything, my gut twisting into a cold, hard knot. The trust I'd built over a quarter-century was evaporating, and I was starting to doubt my own mind. I started to believe I was the problem, that maybe at 54, I was losing it. The final straw came last Tuesday. A young apprentice, kid named Kevin, barely 20, was up on the steel frame, maybe 5 stories high. His safety harness was clipped in, standard procedure. But the anchor point, a welded D-ring, tore clean off the beam. He fell, his lanyard caught him, but it jerked him so hard against a girder that it shattered his leg and broke 3 ribs. He was just hanging there, screaming. It was my worst nightmare. We got him down, and the medics rushed him out. I went up there myself, my hands shaking. I looked at the anchor. It wasn't a faulty weld. The metal around the ring was scored, intentionally weakened with a grinder, then painted over to look normal. It was sabotage, deliberate. An attempt to maim, or worse. That afternoon, Rich had me in his office. This time, the faux concern was gone. His eyes were like chips of ice. "This is it, Mike. A man almost died. I'm putting you on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. But I think you and I both know how this is going to end. Don't bother coming in tomorrow. We'll mail you your things." I just sat there, the words hitting me like physical blows. He was pinning it all on me. The theft, the equipment failures, a near-fatal incident. He had his narrative, and I was the villain. I walked out of that air-conditioned trailer and back into the real world of dirt and noise, a condemned man. But as I walked to my truck, something inside me, something that had been dormant for months, finally snapped. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, chilling clarity. It was too perfect. Every incident was just plausible enough to be an accident, but just damaging enough to make me look incompetent. The weakened anchor point wasn't the work of a drunk or a fool. It was precise. It was methodical. It was evil. That night, I didn't go home and drink myself into a stupor, which is what Rich probably expected. I drove to a hunting supply store and bought a trail camera, the kind you strap to a tree to catch deer. It was motion activated, had night vision, and a battery that would last for weeks. Around 2 in the morning, when the site was dark and silent save for the hum of the security lights, I drove back. I didn't go through the main gate. I knew the weak spot in the fence line on the far side of the property, the one I'd been meaning to get repaired for weeks. I slipped through and made my way to the supply depot, a sprawling area of stacked materials and locked containers. I found a perfect spot, a telephone pole that had a clear, unobstructed view of the high-value containers and the access road. I strapped the camera on, angled it perfectly, and slipped back out into the night. For a week, I was in hell. I was on leave, cut off from my crew, my life's work. My wife, Susan, tried to talk to me, but I was a zombie. The self-doubt Rich had planted was still there, a toxic weed. What if I was wrong? What if I was just a paranoid old man making up conspiracies to avoid facing his own failures? I was on the brink of calling Rich, of just giving up and accepting whatever fate he had planned for me. But this morning, I forced myself to go back. I pulled the SD card from the camera and came home. I put it in my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clicked open the first video file, and the world fell out from under me. The footage was grainy, stamped with the time, 3:17 a.m. A pickup truck, one I recognized, rolled silently up to the premium copper container, its headlights off. The driver's side door opened, and a man got out. He moved with a quiet confidence, a familiarity that made my blood run cold. He pulled a key from his pocket, a master key, one of only 3 on the entire project, and opened the lock as if he owned the place. He turned, and the camera's infrared light caught his face. It was Dave Henderson, my lead hand. The man I'd mentored for 15 years. The man I'd trusted with my life, with the lives of my crew. I'd personally recommended him for the lead hand position. I'd stood up for him when he made mistakes, telling management that he was a good kid with a bright future. I treated him like a son. I watched, frozen, as the video played on. I saw him load spools of copper wire into the back of his truck, methodically, efficiently. Then he moved to the heavy equipment staging area. He pulled a tool from his pocket and knelt beside a brand new Caterpillar excavator. I couldn't see exactly what he was doing, but I knew. He was the one slicing the hydraulic lines. He was the one contaminating the fuel. He was the one grinding down the anchor points. It was him. It was all him. He was stealing the company blind and then creating accidents to cover his tracks, to create chaos and confusion so no one would look too closely at the inventory sheets. He was creating a scapegoat, and he'd chosen me. The old man, the foreman who was supposedly losing his touch. I felt a wave of nausea, then a rage so pure and so cold it felt like my veins were filled with ice. He hadn't just betrayed the company, he'd betrayed me. He'd let me twist in the wind, let me believe I was going crazy, let me take the fall for his crimes, all while smiling to my face every single day. I watched a week's worth of footage, night after night, the same routine. A quiet truck, a familiar face, another piece of my reputation loaded up and driven away. I saved the files. I made 3 copies on 3 separate thumb drives. My first instinct was to drive straight to Rich's office, throw the evidence on his desk, and watch him squirm. But I stopped. What would happen? Rich would go into damage control. He'd fire Dave, sure, but he'd bury the story. He'd spin it. He'd say it was an isolated incident that he in his great wisdom had rooted out. He'd still have his narrative that the site was poorly managed under my watch. The investors would never know the full truth. They'd just see a problem that was handled. No, that wasn't good enough. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about pulling the rot out by its roots. Rich didn't just let this happen, he created the environment for it. His obsession with the bottom line, his dismissal of my concerns, his eagerness to blame me instead of investigating the problem. He was complicit. He had built this narrative about me, brick by painful brick. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. is the quarterly investor meeting. They fly in from New York and Chicago to get a status report. Rich will be there, with his slick PowerPoint presentation and his tailored suit. He'll deliver his report on the project's progress, and I just know, he's going to use this opportunity to formally sacrifice me on the altar of corporate accountability. He's going to tell them he's solved the problem by removing the negligent foreman. He thinks I'm at home, broken and defeated. He has no idea what's coming. I'm not showing the video to my boss, I'm showing it to his, and I'm not just going to clear my name, I'm going to burn his world to the ground. Let me know what you think of this situation. If you've ever been in a position where your loyalty was used against you, you know the feeling. Make sure you subscribe for more stories like this, because what comes next is something you won't want to miss. The rest of that day was a blur of calculated calm. The rage was still there, a white-hot coal bank deep in my gut, but on the surface I was a machine. My house, usually a place of refuge, felt like a command center. The scent of Susan's coffee, normally a comfort, now smelled like fuel. I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open, the damning footage on a loop, the sound off. I wasn't watching it anymore. I was absorbing it, letting the reality of the betrayal sear itself into my memory, so there would be no hesitation, no flicker of doubt when the time came. Susan sat across from me, her hand resting on mine. She wasn't saying much. She'd seen me at my best, building careers and skylines, and she'd seen me at my worst. This past 6 months, a hollowed-out version of myself, aged a decade, by stress and uncertainty. She'd watched me pace the floors at night, heard me muttering about rebar specs and PSI ratings in my sleep. She knew the cost of this betrayal better than anyone. She just watched my face and said, "What's the plan, Mike?" Her voice was steady, a rock in the storm of my thoughts. And that simple question focused everything. It wasn't about what I felt, it was about what I was going to do. The plan couldn't be just about revenge. Revenge is a fire that burns you too. This had to be about justice. It had to be a demolition, not an explosion. Precise, clean, undeniable. To do that, I needed more than just the video. The video was the emotional gut punch, the undeniable proof of Dave's actions. But I needed to show that this wasn't just one bad apple. It was a diseased orchard, and Rich was the one who had poisoned the soil. My mind started to catalog assets, not of materials and equipment, but of people. In this business, your reputation is your most valuable tool, and after 25 years, I had built relationships that ran deeper than any corporate hierarchy. My first call was to a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was the logistics lead for Titan Steel, our primary supplier. She was in her late 40s, sharp as a tack, and had a zero-tolerance policy for nonsense. We'd worked together for a decade, on half a dozen major projects. We had a shorthand, a trust built on years of solving problems at 3 in the morning. When Rich's office had sent out a memo 3 months ago stating that all material requisitions and delivery confirmations were to be routed through Dave Henderson to streamline communications, I had thought it was just more corporate bureaucracy. Now I saw it for what it was, a firewall. Rich had given Dave the keys to the kingdom and a way to hide the evidence. I called Sarah on her personal cell. She picked up on the second ring, Mike, I heard what happened. It's bull, and you know it. Her immediate, unwavering support was like a splash of cold water. It cut through the lingering fumes of self-doubt. I said, Sarah, I need a favor, a big one, and it needs to be off the books. I need you to stay late tonight. I need you to pull every bill of lading for the Pinnacle project from the last 6 months. Specifically, I need copies of every single one that Dave Henderson signed for, and I need you to cross-reference them with the original order manifests. I want to see what was ordered by the project versus what was signed for on delivery. There was a pause on the line. Then I heard the sound of her typing. I knew I'd have to wait. This was a massive undertaking, digging through months of digital and paper records. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was an email from a personal address I didn't recognize. The subject line was just data. Inside was a password-protected zip file. Sarah called a moment later. It's worse than you think, Mike. There are dozens of discrepancies. Premium orders replaced with lower-grade materials on the delivery slips. Quantities reduced. Sometimes whole shipments of specialized components, custom fabrication stuff that costs a fortune, were signed for by Dave, but never even left our yard. The paperwork was forged to look like a completed delivery. He was billing the project for ghost materials. He's stolen, conservatively, over $1 million in steel alone. And because Rich's office told us to only deal with Dave, no one ever questioned it. My jaw tightened. This was the paper trail. This was the proof of systemic fraud that went far beyond a few spools of copper wire. This was the kind of thing that got people sent to prison, not just fired. Thank you, Sarah, I said, my voice thick with gratitude. You have no idea what this means. She cut me off. Yes, I do, Mike. It means competence isn't cheap until you lose it. You told me that once, years ago. Go get him. I hung up the phone, the phrase echoing in my head. It was a mantra I'd repeated to young engineers and apprentices for years, a warning against cutting corners. Now it felt like a prophecy. Next, I needed an inside man. I thought of my crew. Most of them were good people, loyal, but they had families to feed. I couldn't ask them to risk their jobs. But then I thought of Leo. Leo was a young structural engineer, barely 5 years out of college, but he had the kind of sharp, inquisitive mind that you can't teach. He saw the whole picture. I had mentored him, taught him to look past the blueprints and understand the real-world implications of every decision. I knew he was frustrated. He'd come to me a few times, quietly, with concerns about some of the changes Rich had been implementing. Small things, at first, approving a slightly thinner gauge of decking to save a few bucks a square foot, reducing the number of welds on non-load-bearing joints. Rich called it value engineering. Leo and I called it what it was, chipping away at the safety margins. I sent him a simple text. Can you talk? A minute later, he replied. Call me on Signal. I called. His voice was tense. Mike, what's going on? They're telling everyone you were fired for gross negligence. I ignored the question. Leo, listen to me carefully. I need you to do something, but if you're not comfortable, I understand. For the past 4 months, Rich has been overriding architectural specifications. I need a record of it. I need every change order he approved that deviated from the original engineered plans, the ones we both know compromised the integrity, even slightly. Can you get that for me? There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing. I was asking a young engineer to steal proprietary data and hand it over to a disgraced former employee. I was asking him to risk his entire career. He finally spoke, his voice low and determined. They're not just deviations, Mike. He ordered us to use a cheaper sealant for the curtain wall gaskets. The specs call for silicone, rated for 100-mile-per-hour wind load and a 50-year lifespan. He sourced a polyurethane-based sealant from a new supplier. It's rated for maybe half that. On a 40-story glass tower, it'll pass inspection now, but in 10 years, every single one of those seals will fail. The building will leak like a sieve. It's not just fraud, it's a time bomb. I'll get you everything. Send me a secure drop link. I felt a grim satisfaction. This was the final piece. It wasn't just theft. It wasn't just sabotage. It was a fundamental, willful betrayal of the professional ethics that keep buildings standing and people safe. Rich, in his blind pursuit of cost-cutting, had approved a change that would render a billion-dollar asset defective in a decade. It was the kind of long-term negligence that investors, the actual owners of this project, fear more than anything. I spent the next few hours compiling the evidence. I created a simple, devastating presentation. No fancy graphics, no corporate jargon, just the facts. Slide 1, a summary of Sarah's report from Titan Steel, showing over $1 million in material fraud, with Dave Henderson's forged signature on a dozen documents. Slide 2, a spreadsheet created from Leo's data, listing every single unapproved deviation from the architectural plans, with a column estimating the long-term repair costs, which ran into the tens of millions. And the final slide was just a black screen, with a single play button icon. As I worked, my mind kept drifting back to Dave. I remembered the day I hired him. He was a skinny kid, all elbows and nervous energy, but he looked me in the eye and said he was a hard worker. I gave him a chance. I remembered the time on the Bridgeport job, when he misread a blueprint and ordered the wrong size I-beams for a whole section. It was a $100,000 mistake. It should have gotten him fired. I went to the project manager myself. I told him it was my fault, that I hadn't communicated the change order clearly. I took the heat. I covered for him. I saw potential in him, and I wanted to see him succeed. I taught him how to read a site plan, how to manage a crew, how to talk to subcontractors. I invited him to my house for barbecues. My kids knew his name, and this is how he repaid it. The personal sting of it was a separate, deeper wound. The professional betrayal I could understand, in a cold, academic way. Greed is a powerful motivator. But the personal cruelty of letting me believe I was losing my mind, of watching me suffer day after day, that was different. That was a debt that had to be paid in full. By evening, I had 3 identical thumb drives. Each contained the video files in the presentation. 1 for me, 2 for backup. My strategy was set. I wouldn't make a sound until the meeting. I would let Rich walk into that room full of confidence, ready to deliver the eulogy for my career. I would let him build his case, lie to the faces of the men who were paying his salary, and dig his own grave. He thought he was the master of the narrative. He had no idea I was about to become the author, editor, and publisher of his professional obituary. The hours leading up to the meeting were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, the house dark and silent, and I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months was gone, replaced by a granite-like certainty. I was no longer the victim of the story. I was the architect of its ending. I thought about the thematic triggers Rich loved to use in his meetings. Words like accountability, transparency, and his personal favorite, streamlining. He used them as weapons, as tools to make himself sound smart and in control. Tomorrow, I would take those words and turn them back on him. I would show the investors what his brand of accountability really looked like. I would give them transparency they never imagined. I would streamline him right out of a job. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows across my yard. I showered, shaved, and put on my best suit, the one I usually reserved for weddings and funerals. Today it felt like it was for both. Susan came into the bedroom as I was straightening my tie. She just looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "You're ready," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I am." She straightened my collar. "Remember who you are, Mike. You built half this city. Don't let a man who's never had dirt on his hands make you forget that." I kissed her, and the warmth of her belief was the last piece of armor I needed. I walked out to my truck, one of the thumb drives in my pocket, a cold, hard knot of purpose in my stomach. The drive to the site was surreal. I passed buildings I'd helped raise from the ground, monuments to a lifetime of hard work. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a foreman again. I knew the terrain, I knew the weak points, and I was about to conduct the most important demolition of my career. I arrived at the site an hour early. The main gate was a hive of activity. but I wasn't going there. I drove to the temporary corporate building, a collection of high-end modular offices set up a safe distance from the construction itself. This was Rich's domain. The air here was different, cleaner, quieter, sterile. I parked my truck not in the visitors section, but in my old spot, the one still marked foreman. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration that I wasn't here as a supplicant. I saw Rich's assistant, a young woman named Chloe, scurrying toward the entrance with a box of pastries. She saw me and her eyes went wide with panic, as if she'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Miller," she stammered. You're not supposed to be here." I gave her a calm, easy smile. "Morning, Chloe. I'm here for the investor meeting." Rich approved it. She looked confused, clutching the box like a shield. "But," he said. I just held her gaze. "I know what he said, but things change. Could you do me a favor and just make sure my name is on the list for entry? Tell Rich I'm here to provide any on-the-ground technical clarifications the investors might require." I used his own corporate jargon, a language he'd understand. She nodded, flustered, and hurried inside. My first move was made. Not a loud one, but a subtle one. I wasn't crashing the party. I was announcing my presence on my own terms. It would force Rich to react. He'd either have to bar me from entry, which would look suspicious to anyone watching, or he'd have to let me in, where he'd foolishly believe he could control the situation. He was arrogant enough to choose the latter. I sat in my truck and waited. 10 minutes later, Chloe emerged and gave me a stilted, nervous wave. He said, "It's fine. The meeting is in the main conference room." He thinks he's setting a trap, I thought. He's going to let me walk into the lion's den so he can perform a public execution. He has no idea I'm the one who brought the lions. I got out of my truck and walked toward the building. As I did, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo. It just said, "It's done. They're walking out." This was the second part of the silent takeover. The night before, after getting the data from Leo, I had made a few calls. Not to everyone, just to a handful of my most senior, most skilled and most respected crew leaders. A master welder, my best crane operator, the lead electrician, men I'd worked with for over a decade. I didn't tell them the whole story. I didn't need to. I just said, "I have a meeting with the investors tomorrow at 9. I'm going to tell them the truth about what's been happening on this site. If you've been thinking about finding a new job, tomorrow might be a good day to update your resume. I'm not asking you to quit, but I am telling you that things are about to change." It was a calculated risk. I was counting on their loyalty to me and their frustration with Rich's management style. Leo's text was the confirmation. At precisely 8:30 a.m., half an hour before the big meeting, my core team, the irreplaceable nerve center of the entire on-site operation, were walking off the job. They wouldn't make a scene. They'd just pack their tools, tell their immediate subordinates they were taking personal time, and leave. It would create a quiet, creeping paralysis. By the time Rich was finished with his meeting, his project would be dead in the water. No crane operator meant no steel could be lifted. No lead electrician meant no new wiring could be run. No master welder meant no structural work could be certified. He just didn't know it yet. I walked into the conference room. It was exactly as I remembered: a long, polished mahogany table, a massive screen on one wall, and a panoramic window overlooking the project, his version of a throne room. The investors were already there, a half-dozen men and one woman, all in expensive suits, sipping coffee and looking at iPads. At the head of the table was the man I knew was the real power, Mr. Sterling, the managing partner of the investment firm that was backing the entire development. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that didn't miss a thing. He looked up as I entered, a flicker of surprise on his face. Rich was standing by the screen, a wireless clicker in his hand, a smug, confident smile plastered on his face. When he saw me, the smile faltered for a fraction of a second. then returned, wider and more predatory than before. "Ah, Mike," he said, his voice booming with false bonhomie, "glad you could make it. I thought it was important for the board to have the opportunity to ask you a few questions directly." He was laying the groundwork, positioning me as the subject of an inquiry. I just nodded, happy to provide any clarity I can, Rich. I took a seat at the far end of the table, away from the center of power. I was an observer, for now. The meeting began. Rich launched into his PowerPoint. It was a masterpiece of corporate spin. Glossy photos of the tower, charts with upward trending curves that were selectively chosen, and a lot of talk about synergy and proactive management. He was charming. He was slick. He was a phenomenal liar. I watched the investors. They were polite, nodding along, but I could see in Sterling's eyes that he wasn't buying all of it. He was a man who, like me, had built things, and he knew the smell of manufactured reality. Then Rich got to the slide I was waiting for. It was titled, "Addressing Operational Challenges." My name wasn't on it, but my ghost was. He spoke of legacy issues in site management. He mentioned unacceptable material losses and a series of unfortunate, costly accidents. He adopted a somber tone. "It's always difficult when you have to make a change in leadership, but we have identified the root cause of these inefficiencies. We've had to let our site foreman go. It was a necessary step to ensure the integrity and profitability of this project moving forward." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He was painting me as a casualty of progress, a dinosaur who couldn't keep up. He was a captain of industry, making the tough calls. It was at that moment his phone, which was sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate. Violently, it buzzed and skittered across the polished wood, a frantic, angry insect. He shot at a look of pure annoyance, silencing it with a jab of his finger. A few seconds later, it started again. Buzz, buzz, buzz. He ignored it, but then another phone buzzed, and another. The project managers and engineers he had brought in for support were all looking down at their laps, their faces growing pale. The silent exodus was beginning to ripple through the chain of command. The site was starting to report that its brain and central nervous system had just vanished. Rich, oblivious, tried to press on. "As I was saying, the new management structure will be far more." But Sterling held up a hand, his eyes narrowed, not at Rich but at the vibrating phones. "Is there a problem, Mr. Davies? Everything all right on our billion-dollar construction site?" Rich forced a laugh. "Just the usual daily fires, Mr. Sterling. Nothing the team can't handle." My team. But the panic was starting to creep into the edges of his voice. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't show it. Not here, not now. He was trapped. He clicked to the next slide, a generic stock photo of a smiling, diverse construction crew, under the heading, "Our Commitment to People." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He didn't get another word out. Sterling's own phone, a sleek, expensive model, lit up. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. He didn't answer it. He just placed it deliberately on the table and looked directly at Rich. He said, "I've just received a text from the site superintendent. He says every single one of your senior crew leaders walked off the job 20 minutes ago. The crane is idle. The concrete pour has been halted. He says the project is, and I quote, catastrophically stalled. Would you care to revise your assessment that there is nothing the team can't handle?" The blood drained from Rich's face. The smug mask shattered, replaced by raw, naked panic. He stared at Sterling, speechless. His carefully constructed narrative had just been obliterated by a single text message. The room was silent. The air crackled with tension. All eyes were on Rich, a man suddenly and completely out of his depth. He started to stammer. I don't understand. There must be some mistake. They can't just." He looked around the room, his gaze flitting from one stone-faced investor to another, and then his eyes landed on me, on my calm, impassive face, and in that instant, he knew. He didn't know how, but he knew I was the cause. The power in the room had fundamentally, irreversibly shifted. He had walked in as the king, and now he was just a man, in an expensive suit, watching his kingdom burn. The silence in that room was heavier than a slab of concrete. Rich stood there, exposed, the confident presenter replaced by a man drowning in open air. His eyes were locked on me, a mixture of disbelief and dawning, horrified comprehension. He saw my suit, my unnatural calm, and he finally understood that I hadn't come here to plead my case. I had come to pronounce sentence. Sterling broke the silence, his voice dangerously soft. "Mr. Davies, you seem to be at a loss for words. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps it is some kind of mistake, a mass-coordinated walkout of a project's most essential personnel that doesn't just happen. It suggests a profound failure of management, a complete loss of morale. What kind of leader inspires that level of disloyalty?" Each word was a precision strike. Sterling wasn't just questioning Rich's competence, he was dissecting it, holding it up to the light for the other investors to see its flaws. Rich, desperate to regain control, did the only thing he knew how to do. He deflected. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "It's him. It has to be. This is retaliation. He's sabotaging the project because he was fired for negligence. He couldn't handle the pressure, and now he's trying to burn it all down." The accusation hung in the air. A few of the investors shifted uncomfortably. It was a plausible, if desperate, theory. A disgruntled employee lashing out, but Sterling didn't even look at me. He kept his cold, analytical gaze fixed on Rich. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Davies. Do you have any proof that Mike is responsible for this? Or is this another one of your intuitions, like his supposed negligence?" Rich's mouth opened and closed. He had nothing. He was running on pure panicked instinct. This was the moment. I hadn't said a word, but the foundation was laid. I had let his own failures, his inability to retain his key staff, do the talking. Now it was time to bring the walls down. Sterling finally turned to me. "Mike, you've been very quiet. Do you have a response to any of this?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out even and clear. "I do, Mr. Sterling. But my response isn't words, it's data." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small black thumb drive. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and placed it gently next to Rich's useless clicker. Rich flinched as if it were a scorpion. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice cracking. I looked at Sterling. "With your permission?" Sterling gave a curt, decisive nod. I plugged the drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The smiling stock photo crew vanished from the screen, replaced by my own simple black and white presentation. The first slide appeared: material discrepancies, Titan steel forensics. I began to speak, my voice filling the quiet room. "For the last 6 months, this project has been billed for over $1 million in premium-grade steel and specialized components that never arrived on site. What did arrive was lower-grade material, or in some cases, nothing at all. The delivery forms, however, were forged to show a completed order." I clicked. A scanned copy of a bill of lading appeared on the screen, showing a shipment of custom-fabricated seismic dampeners, worth $250,000. At the bottom was a signature, clear as day: Dave Henderson. I then clicked to the next image, an affidavit from Sarah Jenkins at Titan Steel, stating that this shipment never left her warehouse. The signature was a forgery. I could feel the atmosphere in the room change. This wasn't about a disgruntled foreman anymore. This was about organized, high-level fraud. Rich was ashen. He sputtered, "Dave, no, that's impossible. He's my best man." I looked at him. Was he Rich? Or was he just the man you empowered to control all material requisitions, creating a single point of failure and a perfect cover for theft? I clicked to the next slide. Unapproved engineering deviations. A table filled the screen, compiled from Leo's data. Line after line of changes: reduced rebar density, cheaper sealants, non-spec bolts. Next to each item was a column showing the short-term savings, a few $1,000s here, $10,000 there. And next to that was a final column, estimated long-term remediation cost. The total at the bottom was over $30 million. And at the top of the slide was a scanned copy of the primary change order, authorizing the use of the substandard curtain wall sealant. The approval signature was crisp and clear. Richard Davies, one of the investors, a woman in the back, gasped. Sterling just stared at the screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He looked at Rich with an expression of absolute contempt. You were poisoning our asset to inflate your profit margins. To make your quarterly numbers look good, you were building a 40-story liability. Rich could only shake his head, muttering. No, I was assured. The new supplier was vetted. I didn't know. I let his pathetic denials hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, you didn't know, or you didn't ask. There's a difference. But the material fraud and the dangerous cost-cutting are just symptoms of the disease. The real problem has been the accidents. The things you blamed on me. The damaged equipment. The near-fatal incident with the safety anchor. I clicked to the final slide. It was a black screen with a single white play button in the center. And as for where the premium materials really went, and why our equipment kept accidentally failing, I have a video. I hit the space bar. The silent, grainy night vision footage filled the screen, the pickup truck rolling into the depot, the familiar figure of Dave Henderson getting out. The investors leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the ghostly green light from the screen. They watched in dead silence as Dave unlocked the container and began loading it with stolen goods. They saw him move to the heavy equipment, tool in hand. I had edited the footage into a 3-minute compilation of pure, irrefutable criminality. The final shot was a clear, damning close-up of his face as he looked around, thinking he was alone in the dark. The video ended. The screen went black. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Rich was staring at the blank screen, his mouth slightly open, a low, strangled sound coming from his throat. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Then Sterling slid his chair back, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He stood up. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the other investors. He looked only at Rich, and his voice was devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a man making a purely financial calculation. Mr. Davies, your employment with this development corporation is terminated, effective immediately. The same goes for your lead hand, Mr. Henderson. I want you to leave your keys, your company phone, and your ID badge on this table. Security will escort you from the premises. A fraud and safety investigation will be launched, and I assure you, we will be pursuing full criminal charges. Rich just stood there, swaying slightly. But, my contract. My severance. Sterling cut him off with a slice of his hand. Your contract is null and void, due to gross misconduct and illegal activity. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Now get out. Rich finally crumbled. The arrogant MBA, the master of the universe, simply deflated. He slowly, mechanically, placed his phone on the table. He pulled the lanyard with his ID from around his neck. He looked around the room one last time, his eyes pleading, finding no sympathy. Then he turned and walked out of the room, a broken man. The door clicked shut behind him. The power shift was complete. It hadn't been a loud, angry explosion. It had been a quiet, precise demolition, executed with the very data he had tried to suppress and ignore. The competence he'd dismissed had become the weapon that destroyed him. With Rich gone, the tension in the room didn't entirely dissipate. It transformed. The shock curdled into a cold, hard focus on the damage. The investors weren't looking at me with pity or even gratitude. They were looking at me like a surgeon they'd just discovered in the middle of a botched operation. They saw me as the only person who knew where all the arteries were. Sterling broke the silence. He turned to the other board members. Ladies, gentlemen, I suggest you all proceed to the site superintendent's office. Get a full, unvarnished report on the operational status. I need a clear picture of how bad the bleeding is. They filed out silently, a grim procession leaving just Sterling and me in the conference room. He walked over to the panoramic window, his back to me, looking out at the massive motionless crane that stood like a monument to his stalled billion-dollar problem. He spoke to my reflection in the glass. For 6 months, I've been reading Mr. Davies's reports. Slick, optimistic, full of jargon. He told me you were a problem, Mike. A bottleneck, an old-timer who couldn't adapt. I chose to believe the man with the MBA over the man with the dirt on his boots. That's my mistake, and it's going to cost me millions. He turned around, his eyes pinning me in place. The question is, what's it going to cost me to fix it? This was the real negotiation. This was the moment where everything was on the table. The old me, the loyal company man, would have said, "Don't worry, Mr. Sterling, we'll get it back on track. I'll do whatever it takes." But that man was gone, buried under months of betrayal and doubt. I had learned a very hard lesson. Your value is what you demand, not what you are given. I met his gaze without flinching. That depends on what you want, Mr. Sterling. If you want a foreman to just get the project moving again, you can probably find someone. But the problems here aren't just a crooked lead hand and a clueless manager. The rot is in the foundation. The crew has been mismanaged, the specs have been compromised, and the trust is gone. You don't need a foreman. You need a project director with the complete and total authority to rebuild this operation from the ground up. I paused, letting that sink in. I need the authority to fire every subcontractor Rich brought in. I need the budget to tear out and replace every substandard component Leo identified, starting with those curtain wall gaskets. I need to be able to hire my own team at pay scales that will attract the best, not the cheapest. And I'll need a salary and bonus structure that reflects the fact that you're not just asking me to build a tower, you're asking me to save your entire investment. It was a bold, audacious power play. I was a man who an hour ago was unemployed and disgraced. Now I was dictating terms for control of the whole operation. Sterling didn't blink. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He recognized what I was doing. I was speaking his language, the language of leverage. He walked back to the table and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "Draft a proposal," he said. "Give me a number, give me a plan, a list of personnel you want terminated, and a list of personnel you want to hire. I want it on my desk by the end of the day. And Mike," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "don't be gentle." The new workplace reality settled in with the speed of a controlled demolition. I spent the rest of the day not in celebration, but in a whirlwind of focused activity. I set up in the now vacant office of the man who had tried to destroy me. It felt poetic. My first calls were to my old crew leaders. I told them what had happened, and I offered them their jobs back, with a significant raise and a back pay bonus for their trouble. Not a single one hesitated. Their loyalty wasn't to a company, it was to a leader they trusted. By noon, the sound of work was slowly returning to the site as my team returned, the news spreading like wildfire. My next move was to bring in Leo. I walked into the engineering trailer, where he was sitting at his desk, trying to look busy but failing miserably. The other engineers, all Rich's hires, looked at me like I was a hangman. I walked right up to Leo's desk. "Pack your things," I said. He looked up, confused. Am I fired?" I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd had in months. "You're promoted. You're my new lead engineer. You and I are going to go over every single blueprint and every change order from the last 6 months, and we are going to fix this mess." The look of relief and vindication on his face was worth more than any bonus. The talent exodus that had started as my weapon was now reversing. The good people were coming back. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and meetings. I called Sarah at Titan Steel and placed an emergency order for the correct spec materials, authorizing the premium cost. I met with the site superintendent and gave him a list of subcontractors whose contracts were to be terminated immediately for shoddy work. The change was brutal, swift, and absolute. There was no more management by spreadsheet. There was only competence and accountability. Late in the afternoon, I got a call from a local police detective. He informed me that Dave Henderson had been arrested at his home. They had found a garage full of stolen materials from the Pinnacle project and half a dozen other sites he'd worked on over the years. He wasn't just a thief, he was a one-man crime wave who had been hiding in plain sight for years, using his reputation as my trusted protege as his cover. The detective said he confessed to everything, trying to pin the whole scheme on Rich, claiming he was just following orders. It was a pathetic end for a man who had betrayed every ounce of trust I had ever placed in him. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no pity, just a quiet sense of an account being settled. The final confrontation, when it came, was not with Rich or Dave, but with myself. As the sun set, I stood in my new office, looking out at the project. The lights were on, crews were working overtime, the giant crane was moving again, lifting a beam of proper high-grade American steel into place. It was my sight again. I had won. I had not only cleared my name but had risen higher than before. I had my vindication. But the cost had been high. The easy trust I once had in people was gone, replaced by a more cautious, measured respect. I had learned that loyalty, true loyalty, is a rare and precious commodity, and that competence, in the end, is the only currency that truly matters. They had tried to make me incompetent, and in the end, it was their own incompetence that destroyed them. The weeks that followed were a grueling but deeply satisfying campaign of reconstruction. It wasn't just about getting the project back on schedule, it was about rebuilding its soul. We tore out the defective sealants, replaced the substandard steel, and re-welded joints to meet the original, uncompromising specifications. It was expensive and time-consuming, but with every correction we were erasing the legacy of Rich's greed and incompetence. The atmosphere on the site changed. The fear and resentment that had simmered under Rich's tenure were replaced by a renewed sense of pride and professionalism. We were no longer just building a tower, we were fixing something that had been broken, and there's a special kind of satisfaction in that. My relationship with Sterling solidified into one of mutual pragmatic respect. He never once questioned my decisions or my budget. He had made a mistake in trusting the wrong man, and now he was trusting me to fix it. He understood that my expensive methods were in the long run the cheapest way to build something that lasts. True to his word, he and the board pursued the case against Rich and Dave with relentless efficiency. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, both men took plea deals rather than face a jury. Dave got a hefty prison sentence for the sheer scale of his thefts. Rich, the white-collar criminal, got off lighter with probation and a massive fine, but his career in the industry was over. He was disgraced, his name a byword for the kind of arrogant mismanagement that investors despise. I never saw him again. He was just a ghost, a cautionary tale. About 3 months into my new role as project director, Sterling flew in for a site visit. We walked the floors together, and I showed him the progress, the clean welds, the properly installed materials, the high morale of the crews. He was a man of few words, but I could see the approval in his eyes. As we stood on the top floor, looking out over the city, he turned to me. "The board has approved a new name for the tower," he said. "We're no longer calling it the Pinnacle." I must have looked surprised, because he cracked a rare smile. "We're calling it the Sterling Miller Tower. My name is on it because I'm paying for it. Your name is on it because you're the one who actually built it." It was a gesture that went beyond money or titles. It was a public acknowledgement, etched in steel and stone, of the value of competence. It was the ultimate vindication. So now I stand here, in a sense, telling you this story. It's a story about betrayal, about being pushed to the brink, about having everything you've built your life on threatened by the careless ambition of others. But it's not a tragedy. It's a lesson. They say that the best revenge is living well, but I think it's more than that. The best revenge is proving them wrong, not with words but with results. It's about taking the narrative they tried to write for you, tearing it up, and writing your own ending. I learned that in the corporate world, just like on a construction site, there are two kinds of people, those who build and those who take credit. The builders create value through expertise and hard work. The takers create chaos and call it disruption. They try to optimize the human capital, forgetting that that capital is made of people with pride, skill, and a breaking point. For anyone out there who has ever felt undervalued, underestimated, or erased by a boss who couldn't do your job for a single day, my story is for you. Don't let their narrative become your reality. Trust your gut. Document everything. And remember that competence is a weapon that the incompetent can never truly defend against. They can dismiss it, they can ignore it, but eventually gravity always wins. The structures they build on lies and shortcuts will always, eventually, come crashing down. What they don't understand is that competence isn't cheap, but losing it will cost you everything. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories of workplace justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of vindication. Thanks for listening.